Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for joining my presentation. I put in a very long title, but it's, I wanted this to sound pretty corporate in the beginning because it is about, modernizing the corporate world. We'll be talking a bit about leadership experience, but in general, trying to get things done in an environment that is completely against change. I mean, there are change processes, but if you're going into an organization I'm working in, like UBS, and Thomas knows something about it, the change process is usually defined that way. Do whatever you want without changing too much so it doesn't break. So in the end, you're basically paralyzed because what the management is expecting, everyone is expecting, you're going to deliver something without causing any trouble or without, radically changing the approach to anything. And you still need to match with multiple regulatory requirements, internal audit requirements, internal pre-audit requirements, your management requirements, and a lot of others. So I would say it's an environment that's built against change, but you can still achieve it. All right, so I'll move on. I'll skip this. If you want, it'll be available in the material if you want to read about me. I'm in the IT industry for quite a long time. Not that interesting. I wanted to start a bit of a history where I started, to be a bit more involved in the quality. So in 2006, I was working in a very small startup. I was a Danish company. There were literally 3 people in the IT department. I was one system administrator, 2 developers. And the developers told me that they want to get a tool that's called ReSharper. Back then, I was still in the .NET stack. Right now, I'm more in Java. And they said they just want to use it because they want to, fix some of the obvious code issues. And they've done it, just press the button to automatically, update the styles. Then they refactored a few modules. And right after they've been done with it, they submitted their resignation because they found a better paid job, okay? And I was a developer back then. And they said to me, like, everything was tested, it's production ready. It was nothing very important, just the invoicing system for the company. So the only thing that was earning us money. And right after we hit the first invoicing cycle, after the software was put to production, I think we've misinvoiced around 10 clients. 2 of them wanted to resign, and my bosses took me. Was the company that they were building for a long time. Basically, the client satisfaction was probably the only thing that was still driving that company. It wasn't the cheapest. It wasn't the best on the market. It didn't have the best products, they didn't have the best people. It was just that they had very strong relationships and they had a lot of trust. And they lost trust from 10 customers, and it was 10% of our customer base. So it was a pretty serious problem. I was agnostic to software quality assurance back then. I thought you just dropped the code to production. I was still pretty young and unexperienced in this area. And we basically dropped it into production and we tested it in production in the first run. So I had a meeting with the board, and there was 3 of us. So I was managing the IT, they were managing the company. They said, what are we going to do about it? And in the end, there were financial repercussions for myself, right? There wasn't huge amounts of money we've lost, but in the end, we lost only 1 of those 10 clients. But it told me, like, maybe we can do something better about the quality. And that's where we started introducing a few processes and a few things that helped me to actually introduce them into the bigger companies. So one of the things that was happening in that small company, we're building everything into one big library file without any unit testing, without any continuous integration, without any kind of continuous delivery or those concepts, without any quality assurance. It was just basically plain programming as it was in 1970s. And now, when I got into a bank, which was 5 years later, when I got to the bank, the first thing that scared me is in the bank, the same procedures as in this small 3-person company that we never cared about the quality, they were present. All right? There was nothing different. So I'll come to it what it was, but in general, this was scary, right? I already knew back then that something's wrong, and this was supposed to be a very, very modern organization that cares about equality, etc., etc. So what I'm going to tell you about today is the trip that we took throughout the last 5 years in that organization to go from that point where you basically have a bunch of lava code that everyone is really afraid to touch. If you touch it, it will definitely break in production. Without having too many processes, I'll tell you briefly what kind of process we had. I'll tell you why it's sometimes not very good to have, to basically outsource your software quality to external vendor without doing this internally. And we go through keeping your nerves calm, patience, sweat, tears, and blood. And why? Because it's not hard to basically tell your team, yes, we want to improve, and your teams want to improve. But convincing the business and convincing senior management and convincing sometimes regulators that actually you're doing the right thing is the painful point. So moving on, that's how Agile was introduced in UBS. On top of this, the first thing so I went to a few Agile meetings, so I wasn't completely Agile agnostic back then. So they wanted basically to have a change that's done faster. And the first thing you get is like an Agile handbook with 55 documents that you need to fill in for every change. And there was an SDLC process created that had 23 steps, out of which one step was provide code. So it wasn't very agile, and when developers themselves, they did not always have like a strategic business negotiation skills. I would call they're not very good politicians, and they're not good in selling bullshit to the senior management to basically get their attention that something's wrong. When they were complaining, it was the same like on this Dilbert cartoon. So like, you're just complaining because you don't know what it is. And in most cases, it's just somebody comes in and says, your people are complaining, fix this. And it wasn't about fixing the process. It wasn't about fixing anything that we have wrong with our software. It was just about people not complaining because we have introduced that process, and the process is great. And all the management committee agrees. I even heard some comments like, why do you have concerns? This was approved by an MD, like managing director. Okay, so what? And we started from a few things, right? So I sat down with the team. Actually, the first day I was hired, when I came in, I got an information from the client that they're not happy with one particular person. I'm supposed to fire them. Then I've been told that the teams in Poland, because back then I was working in Krakow, they're a bit too expensive. They're not providing value. They're focused on technicalities. They're not delivering as much as they should. They started to introduce those things like Jenkins, and they rebuilt our deployment process. They want to rebuild our component management in production. Why do they need to do it? This is not providing any business value. So we basically sat down and started thinking about what are our do's and don'ts. And why we define that is it's really important on the low level to understand what you want to do, or what's your the things that you don't want to do. And back then, one thing that was pretty damaging to our environment is that we were cooperating with 9 software vendors. So this had immediate positive financial benefit for the company, because if you're hiring a vendor, you can usually negotiate the price. You don't need to worry about the internal pricing of the resources, and then every single line manager. I think we were in 8 locations back then. They could have their own vendor hiring policy, and this created a lot of containers within our application, like silos, where people had basically their own agendas. So every vendor had their own KPIs. There wasn't a KPI set from the from UBS perspective. So let's say, for example, one vendor had a KPI that said the defect leakage ratio to production. So they were raising around 25,000 defects in non-production environments, and we were finding like 25 in production, which is really bad. If you think about it, that every time you release, you have 25 issues that you need to inform the users and discuss with them that there is an issue. And we're running a risk application that's actually telling the bank whether they are good in the investment banking risk level, or they're bad, or they should call for more collateral or not. So thinking about that was pretty bad. But still, they were like, requesting a gold award because they've met their KPI. So that's why I have this point over here is not good. So there are fine consulting companies that can help you. They should come in, but every change that's coming into how things should work should be always set internally, and everyone else outside of it needs to adjust. It doesn't fit well with the managed service model that was being, I would say, promoted the most at UBS back then, but that's that was also one of the factors, that because managed service was promoted, that's why quality culture wasn't promoted. And we're still fighting with parts of the legacy stuff that's left from that period. The other thing that I was really promoted for the 5 years about, I was getting a lot of PR about it from top management, is that you should automate everything. Like, I don't want to have manual testers, I don't want to have any anything that's executed manually, but nobody actually understood what's automation. So in the end, what they're expecting to do is you'll build like 5,000 UI scripts that automate whatever testers test. In fact, one of our vendors built this. The result was there were 2,500 tests that were running for 3 weeks. When they failed, nobody knew what was wrong anyway, so my first decision was just to basically scrap it away. You can't imagine how much I would say pushback you get once you say we've invested into 2,500 automated tests that are practically useful. I just want to decommission all of them overnight. I say no, the quality will be worse. We'll come to it. It didn't go worse. It actually improved, but we'll get to it. So the next thing is planning on rebuilding the software. I'll concentrate on the don'ts. So I had a lot of ambitious developers that came in, and they wanted to rebuild everything that was built for the last 20 years. So our application has 1.5 million lines of Java code, not to mention additional 100,000 lines of Perl, and a long list of SQLs, batch scripts, XML definitions, etc., etc. It's really huge. We had a few guys that started rebuilding it, but rebuilding stuff that your business hasn't invested any money in ended up with people from business coming to me and asking me, you're telling me you can't do B, but your developers are fixing and breaking stuff that actually we never asked you to fix, so what's going on? And this looks really bad when you're going next year with your, I'm not sure how many of you are involved in annual budget negotiations, but it's a quirky process to the least, and it's very political, and it's really all about whom do we trust that will give the money. And if you don't have the right story, again, it needs to be pretty political. If you don't have the right story on how to get your annual budget, and I've seen this happening, you can end up within a few years without any budget and without any people to be able to do anything. So this wasn't too good. And then we had a few guys that just came in from some of the, do unit testing, do component testing, and they wanted to, introduce 100% testing coverage. This ended up people building unit tests in some areas for getters and setters just to read 100% ratio. And again, was a huge waste of time. Hasn't introduced anything, and for some of the cases, people were rewriting their classes to go to a point where they can just test on the return value, and it goes through all of the decision trees within the code. And I think that was the starting point. So the starting point, just to repeat, was there was really no quality culture. If there was any culture at all, this was mainly driven by the multiple vendors. What UBS business cared about is that you keep on delivering, but we were on the verge of not being delivered at all. I just wanted to add, but I'll go back to this slide. So that's how it looked like, right? And then someone in 2016 came in on top of this and said, you have to move to the cloud. And because the cloud became the, I would say, concept of the day, in-memory data grids were the previous concept of the day, work item managers were the previous concept of the day, and we still have it in the code, hadn't removed those concepts because they were obviously introduced. Right now the concept is MFT, if you're interested. And, you know, the beast grew, right? And there was absolutely no control about it. So that's how it looked like. So 2 million lines of code. We have 1.5 now. We had 2 million. We're process heavy. So to release a single change, it was, I'd say, this 23-step SDLC process. But just to give you an example, to change a report, it was taking like, and you wanted just to change one column in the report, it was taking 1.5 months. So you were spending a week to confirm the funding, then 3 weeks to confirm what's the requirement, because for some reason, I still fail to understand why, all of a sudden business analysts had 50 questions about changing one column in the report, and they wanted business to sign off on every single possible value that can be in that column, because if there is a if there is a value that will be in production, that the culture was they'll be blamed because the project failed, okay? So then there was technical analysis where we had to do something called design authority because it was mandated by this SDLC process. And this design authority would tell you what you should code, what you shouldn't code, which ended up some of the junior developers, you know, getting pointers what changes in the code you should do from some of the senior developers, or just kind of anti-agile culture at all. Then they would code it, which was usually 1-2 days. Then it was going to a vendor that was responsible for quality assurance. They were doing 2 weeks SIT. They were running their famous automation tests. And in the end, this was going to production, and we still found bugs with one column. So, and it was obviously about the values in this column, or that we hadn't discussed with all of our possible downstreams that we might be sending a new value. There's loads of stuff. And what happens afterwards, after this 1.5 months, you have additional few weeks of explaining everyone on senior management calls why this has failed, what the impact it has caused. There's a concept we call like an iProd, so there's a production incident that we need to track, then we need to provide remediative steps, and usually the remediative step was, please add additional manual QA step to the regression. Some of these points I went through. So another interesting point was I was a test manager back then, and some of our vendors, they had this process that first business needs to sign off their testing scope. So they were literally sending Excel with all of the test cases for sign off to business person. Then the test manager was supposed to sign it off. So if we had 100 stories to deliver, multiply this through those 3 sign-off emails, including additional their internal emails. They're calling this test design process, okay? So the test design process was going exactly how it was designed. And, well, providing no value, because I was looking at those test cases and the business guys were looking at those test cases, and I basically said, oh, well, okay, I sign off, given that IT confirms it covers all of my requirements. And so those emails were pretty common. And our production quality was really bad. So to give you the scale, we have probably around 15,000 applications in UBS. My application was in the top 20 unstable applications around UBS. We just managed to get out of it 2 months ago. So this was what was 5 years ago. And I was really desperate, right? I didn't know what to do in the beginning. I just came into that project. I knew something about the quality. I've seen the culture. I've seen how things are being done, and even to force people to fix some of the defects. Defect fixing was last minute. Merges were on email because people couldn't merge the code. There was no thing as it. There was no CI. So if you made a code change, and sometimes even the deploy to environments wouldn't tell you whether there was a bug or not, because either you couldn't deploy the code or you just deploy your changes, and somebody was rolling back someone else's changes because they were not compatible. That was just 5 years ago, and I was running defect shaming. So basically every day I had a list of defects. I was getting all of the developers and all of the QAs on the call and all of the management, and I was telling them, this has to be fixed, this has to be fixed, this has to be fixed. Why was it not fixed? It taught me a lot about coordinating shit, but what was probably the best way. And the merge on emails, I would say. And the usual time to deliver a stable build after every significant change was 2 weeks before all of the developers agreed on what to do. So the situation was pretty bad, okay? And it's not like it happened overnight that we've managed to change this culture. So I just wanted to add one more thing. Like, this is a big organization. And one of the things I would say we're not good at in the Western societies is that we usually have very short-term perspective. 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. It's a bit different, for example, in China, where they think like 20 years, 10 years is a short-term perspective, 100 years might be a mid-term perspective. And you need to think in those terms in big organizations. So achieving the transformation will take time. And why will it take time? First, you need to have some kind of senior sponsorship. So the good thing about big organizations is that because it's so big, it's highly unlikely you'll have the same boss for more than 3 years, because people move around. Now the other thing is, if you need to find a business sponsor, you either need to build a relationships that sometimes is not based on how good you are, but it's based on whether this person trusts you or not. And gaining trust sometimes means doing things that are against the rules, even your own rules. So sometimes you need to survive 2 or 3 years doing things that are far from being perfect, just to gain trust, to be allowed to do stuff. So what happens if you don't have trust? People will come over to you and ask you, why have you done it? I don't want you to do this anymore. If you have the trust, they'll say, well, don't worry about it, Gustav, we know we're going to handle it. So whatever you do, and they let you be, basically. The other thing is that there's a scale of application that's involved, and I highly encourage not to use stuff like so let's not make changes or improvements into areas that you don't have actual business functional changes. For 1.5 million lines of code, this took 3 years to go through most of the application areas, and we still have a lot of areas we never pick into. But if you break stuff that actually nobody expected you to even touch, you'll be in big trouble. And it's not about your teams. I keep on saying being the change leader, right? So you're being the person that's trying to introduce this. You're being the person that's trying to promote something new, and that's a problem for you. And then you need to think from that perspective. If you're gone, if there's nobody else, then basically whatever you've done so far is irrelevant. And it also then that's why. I was also talking about the patience, because you'll probably, I remember Michael Jordan saying that he only shot and hit 50% of all of the throws that he'd done in his career. So it's going to be the same when you're a change leader in a big organization. You will fail multiple times. You just need to keep on being patient and remember about the long-term perspective. You want to achieve some change. You want to basically improve things, but it's going to take a lot of time. And the best way and the simplest framework I've learned about at UBS with my experience with big organizations is to take everyone by shock. okay? So do first, announce later, and start selling it, right? So when I say do first, you will have the teams that know what to do. In most cases, the teams will know what to do. If they don't know what to do, and you probably should consider about hiring strategy, which will come into in the end. Then once you have those teams, tell them you can do whatever you want. If something fails, I'm the person that's going to go in and explain. And you set the roadmap not with the people that are your business sponsors or your senior stakeholders. You set the plan with the teams that are down on the ground, because they know what needs to change, because they work on this. The business only sees the result. If you'll be waiting for an approval from someone, you will never get it. Because, oh, well, you might get it sometimes if you're lucky that you have a person that's in a leadership role, senior leadership role in the organization, and he's a risk taker. Okay, there's very few risk takers in big organizations. If you don't have a risk taker, you have to be the risk taker. And then, just to protect your teams, you do the communication, okay? And I was making one mistake in the beginning, that was trying to involve my technical experts, some of the senior business stakeholder meetings. It ended up with them applying like more or less a change freeze on our improvements in 2015, because they got confused, right? And when they get confused, they start being scared that you're not doing the things you're supposed to do. So going back to this simple framework, you announce, and then next day you say these changes are ready, and from tomorrow we're using this process and not the other. And that's how we got rid of the 2,500 failing 3 weeks long running, between 2 or 3 weeks, automation test case that were going through UI. That's how we got rid of so we had 880 manual test cases on top of this. So I think right now, this has been reduced to maybe 130, something like that. It was also a decision made overnight that we're not doing testing from our next release. So you push, right? And then you deal with the public relations. And the public relations is basically you building KPIs. And that's one point that I really like about the numbers, that it's not even about gaming the numbers, but when I started on the announced level, when some of the changes were starting to happen in 2017 and end of 2016, we had like a defect leakage ratio to production at 98%. We weren't doing any more 25,000 defects in non-prod just to be able to get our stats right. So I started showing the stats as they were. And I had the trust that with the changes that we're doing, it's going to start going down. And they started after 5 releases. But for 5 releases, I needed to explain why we have such a poor quality in production, what are we doing wrong, and fight with people of not doing additional manual regression and pushing things as close to the change as possible. So, CIs were built. We've introduced strategies related to unit testing, component testing, and we pushed most of the work to developers. And we completely resigned of having any UI-based automation, outside of one thing that we still have up until today, which is JMeter, but it's only about performance and capacity testing. And at public relations, when you show those stats that the things start to improve, people stop asking you questions, because the thing is, if you're just talking about it without a clear measurement, then they think, this is not that interesting. But if you actually do this through KPI, or whatever you want to call it, maybe it's not the best name, KPI, then you can basically prove that you're right, and then results. And the result in our case is that we have a much better process, we're going to show in a moment. And then take no prisoners basically means within your own organization, you may have teams that will be opposed to this process. They're going to say they need 3 weeks for technical analysis. They need to do extreme manual testing, or they don't want to do unit testing, etc., etc. So you either adjust or you die. We had this simple strategy introduced. It was introduced, I think, within a week for all of the teams straight. And on top of this, we've done like an agile assessment and the other things. And it worked. And where we are today is, well, we also have a lot of new people. There was quite a few people that resigned, especially the more experienced ones. We had a bit of a knowledge loss, but we had better processes, so we were able to rebuild it. I think that's still incorrect, 2 million slides of code. It's 1.5 now. We're process light, so we only have stories for the delivery teams, and that's it they need to worry about. The rest of the stuff, we still have our SDLC process, but the SDLC process is managed by the project managers, so the teams get really involved, not much involvement into it. We went from 3 months to release every 6 weeks, but we currently have a potential capability to release this extremely huge application even more often, because we have components. So it's no longer one monolithic application. We have 46 components that are more or less manageable, and we're still working to have them a bit better shaped and creating a lot of new software. And when we're doing new development, we're creating new software components. Then we have lots of unit testing. We're in general against this concept of testing automation, which is based on automating UI. Probably Tomasz would tell you more about the new strategies, because he's also one of the new people that come into organization with better strategies on how to approach high-level automation. We have excellent production stability. You can believe it or not, but we hadn't had a single production issue for the last 4 releases. So that's 24 weeks. And we're gone from the shame list. We're no longer number 11 on the top 20 unstable applications. We're somewhere like 700 something place. It's only because of our history last year. It's not about anything new. And we also have a culture that right now the teams want to improve the code themselves. Maybe not all of the teams, but everyone understands, because everyone understands that these things work. And the access to those stats that we're better, I'm making sure that we keep on PRing the internal teams as well, saying we have to be doing things right because software is more stable, and we're actually delivering more value to the business in smaller iterations. And the last thing is also important, because we want to have at least some minimal minimal manual testing. The way I define this is more about testers trying to break stuff instead of executing scripts. Okay, so personally, I don't think there's a better person to try to break an application than a human, and that can be achieved through multiple tools or through basically a human trying to go into the application and try to break it. I'm just against people executing scripts and happy paths, just checking if things work. This to me is more or less a job for someone who understands how to code, and it all depends how you want to build your automation strategy. But when you're talking about the UI here, we're talking about interface tests or performance tests or capacity tests that can be scripted. And most of the service and unit testing, at least in our organization, are pushed down on developers. And the developers cannot be quality agnostic. And we also have roles introduced, and it's within our testing strategy that all of our QAs, they're not coders, but they're like a person that's responsible for the product quality in the teams. So they have, it's not really specification by design, it's more about them being involved in understanding what the testers, what the developers are covering, more or less understanding that code. They don't have to be coders. And then making sure that whatever's left in the other areas that needs to be covered by testing is covered either by like chaos monkey tests or some of performance tests, or basically their manual tests. But the amount of manual testing has also rapidly gone down. So instead of executing 50 scripted test cases per every story, they maybe execute 1 or 2 right now, sometimes none, and it still works, and its quality is still better. And where are we heading? So we have pretty ambitious plans for the next 2-3 years, given the scale of our application, given all of the requirements that we need to fulfill, and given all of the audit answers that I need to be giving, that we're actually audit compliant. And you can believe it or not, there are some regulators that still expect you to have checklists for every single step in your software development. So they want to see requirements sign-off. They want to see testing evidence. They want to see that the developers review the code. They want to peer into every single aspect of software delivery. And I'm part of some of the groups within UBS where we're going back and challenging what benefit does it give you. So what benefit does it give you that a business person signed off the requirements? If the deliverable is wrong, and if the team has misunderstood what needs to be delivered, it still will be wrong, even if it's signed off. And I can tell you what happens if you go to a business person and tells them, you signed it off. I don't care. It doesn't work. You need to fix it. So that's the only benefit of a business sign-off, that you upset a business person. What's the benefit of having a forced code review culture? So if you have a forced code review culture, that means that your teams are not working, basically, because people should want to sit down and discuss the changes, understand the changes, and learn from them. Not that you can tick a box because somebody, we have Git introduced, that somebody else merged my code, so this means the change was reviewed. I can tell you that anything that's forced on the teams are the best in general in telling you what is the way they want to work. You just need to tell them what's the framework, what do you expect. In our world, the expectation is that they deliver value to business and that we have stable production. And I don't really have any other expectations. And then on top of this, we'll be introducing a new expectations that I want them to deliver, to be capable to deliver every 5 to 10 days. It's still very slow compared to the market, but given the fact it takes me 5 days to prepare paperwork for every release, it's the best we can do at the moment. And we're moving to cloud, but it's not like we're operating a Google service or an Amazon service or a service that's processing multiple clients around the world, and we need to have a lot of redundancy. We have an internal system. So if you're talking to your managers about moving to cloud, the first question you should ask is what for? Right? I've heard some people saying that some of our COBOL applications should move to cloud. And I keep on telling, AS400 is much, much better for those applications and will be much, much stable. And it still has 15% of the market around the world. So why do we want to move to cloud? It's not going to, put your costs lower. And on top of this, you won't find developers to do it. And you won't find the tools to do it. So the things that we put to pass is basically, our web applications, or just the web UIs, and the rest we still manage this the old school way. So we know what's our system capacity, we know where to deploy it. We have something that's called infrastructure as a service, but I don't want to go into details. This concept is introduced wrongly in my company. And basically we control how the application scales, and it's fully scalable. It's just that we don't have the need of scaling, and probably in the next 26 or 30 years until I die, we won't have the need to scale it, because it has a set or fixed number of people that's using it, and it's never changed. And the number of trades that we're processing, might go down or up 20 or 30%. Will never change. So the scalability component is not really the most important thing. Stability component is the most important thing. And next concept that we're trying to introduce is something, if you work in a big organization, you probably heard about business continuity management. So business continuity management is all about being able to switch over in case of a disaster. And there's a lot of fuss around, there's loads of controls. If you've ever been through Ernst & Young, SOX, or mass audits, you would know that you need to provide a lot of documentation around it. But what we want to do is basically, why do we need BCM? We're living in 21st century. We want the components to fail over automatically. And that's something that we want to introduce. And you can't imagine how much pushback we're getting for this, because it's not what the procedures expect, right? Nobody else has it. And they don't see a need to do it, because then it justifies having, extremely huge production support teams. We're not yet in terms of there yet in terms of code ownership. And code ownership is basically that I'm planning to delegate the code quality ownership completely to the teams. And if somebody comes from the managers telling me that they're not building the right code, it will be a question rather, what are you doing wrong, so that they're building this stuff wrong, or what's wrong with our hiring policy, that we're hiring wrong people, that they don't know what means taking the responsibility for the code. And we still want to have manual testing, right? And I don't think removing manual testing will solve anyone's problems. As I said, the human being is the best place to try to break the system. And now moving back a bit, I'll move to this slide about the Agile Basics hiring. And that's how we're trying to execute our hiring strategy. If you were on the workshop with Tomek, he probably was talking about similar stuff. But I don't hire the best people. That's the one. First, my rule of thumb, I don't want to hire the best people. I don't want prima donnas. I want people that understand the organizational goals, people that I know that will cope with me okay, and people that want to evolve more or less. And by following this strategy, we were also able to facilitate our improvements better. Okay, so I don't want a person that comes in and says something's wrong because we don't have 25-page process that nobody ever follows. I want a person to come in and say, this isn't working, that isn't working, this isn't working, and then I'm going to say, good, what do you want to do about it? And they say ABC, and that's the kind of people you want to have in your organization. And then you say, just do it, and if it breaks or anything happens, I'm there to go and explain to senior stakeholders why we have done it and what's the benefit and the long-term benefit. And I also promised a bit of magic. So when I came in, I told you what was the situation, right? So, the lack of CI, problems with the releases, problems with merges. I think at least 6 people were telling me you can't change it. I wasn't the only person that changed it, but I'm one of the people that kept on believing this can be changed. Out of those 6 people, 1 got convinced and stayed. 5 others went to another organization that's pretty big, that's in the same shape, and I go out on beers with them and they tell me how bad this is, how bad that is, etc., etc. But they still don't see the need of change, or at least they don't see they don't see the benefit of being the leader of the change. And at some points they're laughing at our new process, that it's actually just we have the process but business is unhappy. We had that period, and you also need to be prepared for it. When you're introducing a change, business will be unhappy because you'll have more production issues when you're touching the legacy stuff. But it's all about keeping this long-term perspective, and it worked in our case. And that's the magic. So that's all, folks.